This is the second part of the video solution for section 5.2, problem number 2. So the next part asks us to give a motion diagram. All right. And so what we want to do is we want to do a sign analysis of velocity. All right. So I'm going to take my velocity and I'm going to do a sign analysis on a number line. All right. And so what we have to do is we actually have to take our velocity and set it equal to 0 and solve. So when we look at it, we're going to set the numerator equal to 0. So negative 3 times t squared minus 1 equal to 0. And then the denominator equal to 0 because that would make our derivative undefined. T squared plus 1 squared equals 0. All right, so we can see here that the negative 3, we can just divide by it. And then we have t squared plus 1 equals 0. So we add 1 and square root, so t equals plus or minus 1. All right, and so negative 1 and positive 1 are going to go on our number line. Remember, our domain is negative 2 to 2, so those are both in the domain. All right, and then I have t squared plus 1 squared. But if I square root 0, then I have t squared plus 1 equals 0. And if I subtract 1 and square root, now I get that t is equal to plus or minus I, right? But I is not a real number, and it is not in our domain of negative 2 to 2 on the real number line. So that doesn't really play a role. All right, but it is a factor, and so it should be listed when we do the sign analysis. All right, so on the top, I'm going to put negative 3 times t squared minus 1, and the bottom, which is still a factor, t squared plus 1 squared. All right, so now on the top row, I'm going to put a 0 above negative 1 and a 0 above positive 1. All right, the bottom row is never equal to 0, right? And it's never undefined, right? So I just don't put any zeros there, but think about it. If you plug any number into t squared plus 1 squared, you're going to get a positive. So it really just always contributes a positive. All right, what about this top factor? All right, pick a number to the left of negative 1. How about negative 2? Negative 2 squared is positive 4 minus 1. That's positive 3, but times negative 3 is negative. All right, pick a number in between. How about 0? 0 squared minus 1. That's a negative times a negative is a positive. All right, and then on the right, like 2 squared is 4 minus 1 is positive 3, but times negative 3 is negative. So what does that mean? All right, our derivative is negative, then positive, then negative. All right, so that means travels left, travels right, and then travels left again. All right, so now my motion diagram, all right, we have our starting location at t equals negative 2, right? That's our starting location. So I actually need to know where I start. So s of negative 2. Then I'm going to travel to the left until I get, well, to some location, right? T equals negative 1, right? Now, how far to the left did I get? Well, I don't know. So I need to actually do that. So s of negative 2, then s of negative 1. Then I'm going to travel to the right, and then I need to know how far I get at t equals positive 1. So s equals positive 1. And then I need to know where I end up with at the end point of s equals 2. So I'm going to do another s equals 2. All right, so s equals negative 2. So I need to look at my original function. So t squared plus 3t plus 1 over t squared plus 1. All right, so I have negative 2 squared plus 3, plus 3 times negative 2 plus 1, and divided by negative 2 plus 1, negative 2 squared plus 1. All right, so negative 2 squared is positive 4 plus 3 times negative 2. So positive 4 minus 3 times 2, right? So 4 minus 6 is negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1 divided by negative 2 squared plus 1 is 5. So negative 1/5. So that would be negative 1/5. So that's where we're starting. All right. And we travel to the left and we get to some location at t equals negative 1. So now negative 1 squared plus 3 times negative 1. I don't know why it doesn't want me to write. Plus 1, and then divided by, that should be a plus there, sorry, and then negative 1 squared plus 1. All right, negative 1 squared is positive 1, minus 3 is negative 2, plus 1 is negative 1. But now, negative 1 squared is 1 plus 1 is 2, so negative 1/2. So if I started at negative 1/5, did I actually go to the left if I ended up at negative 1/2? And the answer is yes, right? Remember, this is like negative 0.2, and this would be negative 0.5. So that is true. All right, now I travel to the right, and I keep going until I get to t equals 1. But how far to the right did I actually get? So now I need to do s of 1. So 1 squared plus 3 times 1 plus 1 over 1 squared plus 1. All right, so let's move it up a little bit. All right, so 1 squared is 1 plus 3. 4 plus 1 is 5 divided by 1 plus 1, 2, 5/2. So I went to the right until I got as far right as 5/2. Okay, so that's a pretty easy question. If I'm at negative 1/2 and I went to positive 5/2, of course I went to the right. All right, and so that's at t equals 1. Right? And then lastly, I stopped and I turned around and I traveled back to the left until I got to t equals 2. All right, so then how far to the right did I actually get? All right, so let's see. So I have 2 squared plus 3 times 2 plus 1 divided by 2 squared plus 1. All right, 2 squared is 4 plus 3 times 2, right? So that would be 6. So 4 plus 6 is 10, plus 1 is 11, divided by 2 squared, 4 plus 1 is 5, 11/5. So remember, 11/5 is 2.2. So if I'm at 5/2, which is 2.5, I travel to the left, and I ended at 11/5, or 2.2. So I did indeed travel back to the left, judging by where those points are. And so I end at t equals 2. So that's a motion diagram. Started at negative 1/5, travel to the left to negative 1/2, travel back to the right to positive 5/2, travel back to the left to 11/5. All right. So that is the second part of 5.2, number 2.